In ancient Rome, breaking a sacred law was not just a crime. It was an offense against the gods themselves. And when the accused was a woman, the punishment often became something far more than justice. It became ritual. It became spectacle. And sometimes, it became silence. Welcome to Forbidden Archives. Today we're opening a chapter that Rome wanted to remember, but only in a very specific way. Not as cruelty, not as injustice, but as divine necessity. Because in Rome, when religion controlled power, accusation became a weapon. And the gods were always watching. Religion was not optional. In ancient Rome, religion was not private belief. It was not something you practiced on weekends or kept to yourself. It was the foundation of the state. Temples stood at the center of every city. Omens were consulted before every military campaign. Sacrifices were performed before political meetings. The Romans believed that their empire existed because the gods allowed it. And if the gods withdrew their favor, if the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, was broken, Rome itself would collapse. So religion was not just spiritual. It was structural. It held the republic together. It justified wars. It legitimized emperors. And the people who managed that relationship with the divine, the priests, were not simply spiritual leaders. They were guardians of divine order, political players, power brokers, protectors of the state. What was sacrilege? When a woman was accused of breaking a sacred law, it wasn't treated like ordinary misconduct. It was called sacrilegium, sacrilege. And sacrilege was not just a violation of rules. It was an attack on Rome itself. The specific accusations varied, but they usually fell into categories. Breaking a sacred vow. If you had made an oath to a god, especially as a priestess or temple servant, and you violated it, you were accused of betraying divine trust. Violating ritual purity. Roman religion was obsessed with purity. Certain people, especially priests and priestesses, had to maintain ritual cleanliness. Any contamination, real or perceived, could be grounds for accusation. Disrespecting temple rites. If you entered a sacred space improperly, touched forbidden objects, or disrupted a ceremony, you could be charged with impiety. Being involved in impious acts. This was the vaguest and most dangerous accusation. It could mean anything from practicing foreign religions to being associated with people the state didn't like. The key thing to understand is that these were not strictly legal charges. They were religious charges. And religious charges didn't require the same standards of proof. Rumors could be enough. Omens could be enough. The word of a priest could be enough. Why women? You might be wondering, were men also accused of sacrilege? But not as often, and not in the same way. Roman religion had specific roles for women, especially around fertility, chastity, and domestic rights. Women were seen as spiritually powerful but also spiritually vulnerable. They could intercede with certain gods, goddesses of the hearth, of childbirth, of marriage. But they could also be corrupted, polluted, used by malevolent forces. So when something went wrong, when crops failed, when plagues came, when battles were lost, Rome looked for spiritual explanations. And often, those explanations involved women. A widow who didn't mourn properly. A priestess who made a mistake during a ritual. A woman who was seen with the wrong people. It was easier to blame them than to question the generals, the senators, the system itself. The power of accusation. Here's the thing about religious accusations. They were almost impossible to disprove. If you were accused of angering the gods, how do you prove you didn't? You can't point to evidence. You can't call witnesses to testify about your inner spiritual state. You can only defend your reputation, your character, your associations. And if the priests decided you were guilty, if the omens confirmed it, If the political winds were blowing against you, there was almost nothing you could do. Because you weren't just fighting human judgment. You were fighting divine judgment. Or at least, that's what they said. The atmosphere of fear. For women in Rome, especially those connected to temples, religious rites, or prominent families, the fear was constant. One mistake, one rumor, one political enemy, and suddenly, your name is whispered in the forum. Your house is searched. Priests are called. The gods are invoked against you. And once that process starts, it's very hard to stop. Because no one wants to be seen defending someone the gods might be angry with. No one wants to risk divine wrath by association. So people step back. Your friends go quiet. Your family distances themselves. And you stand alone. Not just slaves. When we think about religious persecution in Rome, it's easy to assume the victims were mostly slaves or lower-class women. People with no power, no voice, no protection. And yes, they were vulnerable. But they weren't the only ones. Religious accusations in Rome cut across class lines. Because religion was not just about belief, it was about power. And power means that anyone can become a target. Noble women. Some of the most famous cases of religious accusations involved women from Rome's elite families. These were women with wealth, with education, with family connections to senators and generals. But none of that protected them if the political winds shifted. In 186 BC, there was a scandal known as the Bacchanalia affair. The Bacchanalia were religious rites dedicated to Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy. They had been practiced for years, secret nighttime ceremonies involving music, wine, and ritual. But then the Senate declared them dangerous, subversive, a threat to Roman morality. Thousands were arrested. Many were executed. And among them were noblewomen, wives of prominent citizens, accused of participating in immoral rites. We don't know exactly what happened in those ceremonies. The accounts we have are written by people who wanted to justify the crackdown. But we know that being a noblewoman didn't save you. If the state decided a religion was dangerous, anyone connected to it became suspect. Priestesses. Rome had many priestesses. Women dedicated to serving specific goddesses. The most famous were the Vestal Virgins, but there were others. Priestesses of Ceres, priestesses of Bona, priestesses of Isis, after Egyptian religion spread to Rome. These women held respected positions. They performed rituals essential to the state's spiritual health. But that respect came with intense scrutiny. If a ritual went wrong, if the omens were bad, if something unexpected happened during a ceremony, the priestess could be blamed. Not because she did anything wrong intentionally, but because Romans believed that ritual had to be performed perfectly or it wouldn't work. One mispronounced word, one wrong gesture, one moment of distraction, and the entire ceremony was invalid. Worse, it might have angered the gods. So if disaster struck after a flawed ritual, the priestess could be held responsible. Not legally, but spiritually. And in Rome, spiritual responsibility could be just as dangerous as legal guilt. The Vestal Virgins. The Vestals were sacred. They were chosen as young girls, usually between ages 6 and 10, from respectable families. They served for 30 years. And during that time, they had to remain virgins. This wasn't just a personal vow. It was tied to the survival of Rome itself. The Vestals guarded the eternal flame in the temple of Vesta. As long as that flame burned, Rome was safe, protected by the gods. If the flame went out, even by accident, it was seen as a catastrophic omen. And if a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, that was unthinkable, because a Vestal's purity was directly connected to Rome's divine favor. If she was no longer pure, the gods might abandon the city. Plagues, famines, military defeats. All of these could be blamed on a Vestal's impurity. So when a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow, it wasn't just a personal scandal. It was a national crisis. How accusations started. Vestal virgins were accused of breaking their vows throughout Roman history. Sometimes because of actual relationships, though even then, the evidence was often circumstantial. But sometimes, the accusations were political. If Rome was suffering, if crops failed, if an enemy won a battle, if a plague struck, people looked for explanations. And accusing a Vestal was a convenient way to explain why the gods were angry. It shifted blame away from the generals who lost battles, away from the politicians who made bad decisions, away from the economic policies that caused food shortages. Instead, it placed the blame on one woman. And once she was accused, the pressure to convict her was immense. Because if she wasn't guilty, then why were the gods still angry? The stories we know. We have records of multiple Vestals being accused and punished. In 483 BC, a Vestal named Appia was accused of unchastity and executed. In 420 BC, two Vestals, Postumia and Minutia, were accused. Postumia was acquitted. Minutia was not. In 216 BC, after Rome's catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Cannae, two Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, were accused of breaking their vows. Both were executed. In 114 BC, three Vestals, Emilia, Licinia, and Marcia, were accused. All three were convicted. Notice the pattern? Many of these accusations came during times of crisis, when Rome needed someone to blame. Foreign women and foreign religions. As Rome expanded, it absorbed people from all over the Mediterranean. Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, Jews, Gauls, Iberians, and with them came foreign religions. Rome was generally tolerant of other religions, as long as they didn't threaten Roman authority. But sometimes foreign religions were seen as dangerous, subversive, un-Roman, and the women who practiced them became targets. The cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, was particularly controversial. Isis was a powerful goddess. Her rites involved women in leadership roles, secret initiation ceremonies, emotional, ecstatic worship. To conservative Romans, this looked dangerous. Too much freedom for women, too much secrecy, too much emotion. So multiple times throughout Roman history, the Senate tried to suppress Isis worship. Temples were torn down. Priestesses were arrested. Followers were exiled. And the women involved, many of them Roman citizens who had simply converted to a religion they found meaningful, were accused of practicing foreign superstition. Not because they had broken any law, but because their religion made the authorities uncomfortable. The innocent. We need to be clear about something. Not every woman accused of sacrilege was guilty. In fact, many, perhaps most, were not. They were victims of political rivalry, religious panic, scapegoating, personal vendettas, bad timing. A woman could live her entire life piously, carefully, obediently. And then one bad harvest, one military defeat, one accusation from the wrong person, and everything she had built could collapse. Because in Rome, innocence was not always a defense. Not when the gods were involved. This was not a normal trial. When a woman was accused of sacrilege, the trial that followed was not like a criminal trial. It was a religious proceeding. And religious proceedings operated under different rules. Who judged? The judges were not neutral legal experts. They were priests, pontiffs, augurs, and other religious officials who interpreted divine will. Magistrates, political leaders who represented the state. Witnesses, people who claimed to have seen or heard something relevant. And sometimes, the gods themselves, through divination and omens. In cases involving Vestal Virgins, the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, presided over the trial. This was not a jury of peers. This was a panel of men whose job was to protect Rome's relationship with the gods. And if that meant sacrificing one woman to restore divine favor, they would do it. The interrogation. The accused woman would stand before this assembly, surrounded by men, in a sacred space, under enormous pressure. She would be questioned about her conduct, her associations, her spiritual state. Had she performed rituals correctly? Had she maintained purity? Had she been seen with anyone inappropriate? Had there been any signs, any omens, suggesting divine displeasure? The questions were designed to expose guilt, not to establish innocence. Because the assumption was already there, something had gone wrong. Rome was suffering. The gods were angry. Someone must be responsible. Evidence was thin. In many cases, the evidence was shockingly minimal. A Vestal might be accused because someone claimed to have seen her speaking privately with a man. Her behavior was too friendly. She had been careless during a ritual. An omen had been interpreted as pointing to her. There were no forensic standards, no requirement for multiple witnesses, no presumption of innocence, just suspicion and fear. The power of omens. One of the strangest aspects of these trials, from a modern perspective, is the role of divination. Romans believed that the gods communicated through signs. The flight of birds, the behavior of animals during sacrifice, thunder, lightning, unusual natural events. Augurs, priests trained in reading omens, would be consulted, and their interpretation could determine the outcome of a trial. If an augur said the omens were bad, it confirmed guilt. If the omens were unclear, the trial might continue. If the omens were good, well, that was rare once an accusation had been made. Because by the time a woman was standing trial for sacrilege, the assumption was that the gods were already displeased. Otherwise, why would Rome be suffering? The accused had few options. The woman on trial had almost no power. She could not call witnesses on her own behalf, at least not easily. She could not cross-examine her accusers. She could not appeal to a higher authority, because the priests were the highest authority in religious matters. All she could do was defend her character, swear her innocence, appeal to her reputation, and hope that the men judging her believed her. Political influence. Behind the scenes, politics played a massive role. If the woman came from a powerful family, her relatives might try to intervene. They might offer bribes, call in favors, threaten retaliation. If that worked, the charges might be quietly dropped, or the trial might be delayed until the crisis passed. But if her family had enemies, or if the political situation made her a useful scapegoat, no amount of influence could save her. Because at that point, her convictions served a purpose. It allowed Rome to say, "We have dealt with the source of divine anger. The gods will forgive us now." Public opinion. The public didn't attend these trials the way they attended gladiator games. But they knew about them. Gossip spread through the city. People debated in the forum. Accusations became public knowledge. And once the public believed someone was guilty, it became almost impossible to acquit them. Because if you acquit someone the gods are supposedly angry with, what message does that send? That the priests were wrong? That the omens were misinterpreted? That would undermine the entire system. So even if there were doubts, even if the evidence was weak, the pressure to convict was enormous. The verdict. When the verdict came, it was presented as the will of the gods. Not as a human decision, not as a legal conclusion, but as divine judgment. If the woman was found guilty, it meant the gods had condemned her. And if the gods had condemned her, then the punishment was not cruelty. It was righteousness. Rome was simply carrying out the gods' will. The problem Rome faced. When a Vestal Virgin was found guilty of breaking her vow, Rome faced a unique problem. She was sacred. Her body had been consecrated to the goddess Vesta. She had spent years, sometimes decades, serving the state as a holy guardian. To execute her like a common criminal would be improper. To spill her blood would pollute the city. So Rome needed a solution that preserved ritual purity while still delivering punishment. They found one. A punishment that was technically bloodless, but absolutely brutal. The ceremony begins. On the day of execution, the condemned Vestal was led through the streets of Rome. Not in chains, not dragged, but processed. She was placed on a covered litter, a ceremonial bed carried by attendants. The litter was sealed. The crowd couldn't see her face. This was important, because she was still, technically, sacred. Even in condemnation, Rome maintained the ritual fiction that she was being honored. The walk to the Campus Celeratus. The procession moved slowly through the city toward a place called the Campus Celeratus, the evil field. It was located just outside the city walls, near the Colline Gate. This was deliberate. The execution could not happen inside Rome itself, because spilling sacred blood, or even causing a sacred person's death, inside the city would pollute the entire community. So they took her outside, beyond the boundary, into a space that was legally and spiritually separate, the underground chamber. At the Campus Celeratus, there was a small underground chamber. It had been dug specifically for this purpose. Inside the chamber, Rome placed a lamp, so she would not die in complete darkness. A small amount of food, bread, water, milk, oil. A couch, so she would not have to lie on the ground. These were not acts of mercy. They were ritual necessities. Because Rome needed to be able to say, "We did not kill her. We gave her what she needed to survive." The gods judged her. She was sealed inside. The Vestal was brought to the opening of the chamber. A ladder led down into the darkness. She descended, and then the entrance was sealed. Earth was piled on top. The opening was covered with stone. And the crowd, the priests, the magistrates, the people who had gathered to witness, turned and walked away. In silence. The lie Rome told itself. Here's the fiction Rome maintained. We did not execute her. We gave her food. We gave her light. We gave her shelter. If she dies, it is because the gods have judged her unworthy to live. We are blameless. This is a form of moral laundering. By creating a situation where death is inevitable but not directly caused by human hands, Rome could claim innocence. The woman suffocated, or starved, or died of thirst when the provisions ran out. But technically, no Roman killed her. The earth did. The gods did. Fate did. Not Rome. How long it took? We don't know exactly how long it took for a Vestal to die in that chamber. Hours? Days? It would depend on many factors. The size of the chamber, the amount of air, her physical condition. But we know it was not instant. And we know she was conscious. But where? Alone. Buried alive beneath the city she had served. What happened to the man? If a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow, it usually meant there was a man involved. His punishment was different. He was taken to the forum, tied to a post, and publicly flogged to death. It was brutal, bloody, public. But it was over relatively quickly. The woman's punishment, by contrast, was hidden, slow, and designed to preserve the appearance of ritual purity. This tells us something important about how Rome viewed gender and punishment. Men could be visibly destroyed. Their bodies could be broken in public. But women, especially sacred women, had to be disappeared. Not because Rome was more merciful to them, but because their pollution had to be contained. How often did this happen? Live burial of Vestal Virgins was rare. Over the 1,000-year history of the Vestal Order, we have records of perhaps 20 cases. But the rarity doesn't diminish the horror. Because every Vestal knew this was possible. Every girl chosen for the order grew up knowing, if you break your vow, this is how you die. That knowledge shaped their entire lives. The psychological torture. Imagine being 6 years old when you're chosen. You're taken from your family. You're told you're special, sacred, chosen by the gods. But you're also told, you must never touch a man. You must never marry. You must never have children. For 30 years. And if you break that vow, even once, even accidentally, even if you fall in love, you will be buried alive. That is not just a rule. It's a form of lifelong psychological control. These women lived their entire youth under the threat of this punishment. Why Rome did this? Rome buried Vestal Virgins alive because it solved multiple problems at once. It removed the polluted woman without spilling sacred blood. It demonstrated Rome's commitment to divine law. It terrified other Vestals into absolute obedience. And it gave the public a sense that justice, divine justice, had been served. But most importantly, it allowed Rome to externalize responsibility. The city could say, the gods demanded this. We simply obeyed. And once you've convinced yourself that you're just following divine orders, you can justify almost anything. Not all cases were so ceremonial. The burial of Vestal Virgins was the most dramatic and most ritualized punishment. But most women accused of sacrilege faced different fates. Less theatrical, but still devastating. So, one of the most common punishments for religious crimes was exile. The woman would be stripped of her citizenship. Her property would be confiscated, and she would be ordered to leave Roman territory. This sounds almost merciful compared to execution, but in practice, it was often a death sentence. Where could an exiled woman go? She had no legal protection outside Rome. No rights. No resources. If she had family willing to take her in, she might survive. But most families wouldn't risk harboring someone condemned for sacrilege. It would bring divine displeasure on them as well. So exiled women often ended up as beggars, or slaves, or dead within months. Rome didn't have to kill them directly. It just removed all means of survival and let nature take its course. Public shaming. Some women were sentenced to public humiliation rather than exile or death. This could involve being paraded through the forum, stripped of status symbols, sometimes with head shaved, while the crowd jeered. Being forced to perform demeaning labor, cleaning temples, washing floors, tasks that emphasized their fall from grace. Being marked. In some cases, women were branded or tattooed to permanently identify them as having been condemned for sacrilege. The goal was not just punishment. It was to make an example, to show every other woman, this is what happens when you step out of line. Confiscation of property. For wealthier women, the financial consequences could be just as devastating as physical punishment. When a woman was convicted of sacrilege, her property could be seized by the state. Her house, her slaves, her inheritance, everything. This served two purposes. First, it enriched the state. The confiscated wealth went into the public treasury or into the pockets of the officials who managed the case. Second, it impoverished her family. Even if the woman herself was spared, her relatives lost everything. This created a strong incentive for families to prevent accusations in the first place. Keep your women obedient. Keep them quiet. Keep them out of situations that might be misinterpreted. Because one accusation could destroy an entire household. Imprisonment. Some women were sentenced to indefinite imprisonment. Not in the way we think of prison today. Rome didn't have a developed prison system for long-term incarceration. Instead, these women were placed in the custody of a temple or a religious institution. Effectively, they were enslaved to the priesthood. They would spend the rest of their lives performing menial labor for the very institution that condemned them. Cleaning. cooking, serving, no freedom, no appeal, no escape. And because it was framed as religious service rather than punishment, it was considered merciful. Mass arrests. During times of severe crisis, Rome sometimes arrested groups of women. In 184 BC, after a series of military defeats and a plague, hundreds of women were arrested and accused of poisoning. The accusation was vague, something about corrupting sacred rites and causing divine anger. Many were executed. Others were exiled. The exact number is unclear because the records are fragmentary. But the pattern is clear. When Rome was afraid, it looked for scapegoats. And women, especially women associated with foreign religions or unorthodox practices, were easy targets. The Bacchanalia purge. We mentioned this earlier, but it's worth exploring in detail. In 186 BC, the Senate declared the Bacchanalia, religious rites dedicated to Bacchus, illegal. Thousands were arrested across Italy. The official reason was that the rites involved immorality, conspiracy, and threats to the state. But the real reason seems to have been that the Bacchanalia gave women too much independence. These were secret ceremonies. Women-led. Ecstatic. Emotional. They took place at night, away from male supervision. To the conservative Roman elite, this was intolerable. So they crushed it. Temples were destroyed. Priestesses were executed. Participants were exiled. And Rome called it a victory for morality. The punishment was not always physical. It's important to understand that not all punishment was about the body. For many women, the worst punishment was the destruction of reputation. In Roman society, a woman's reputation was her value. If she was accused of sacrilege, even if she was acquitted, the stain remained. People whispered. Families avoided her. Marriage prospects disappeared. She became infamous, dishonored. And in Rome, dishonor was sometimes worse than death. Because you could survive exile. You could survive poverty. But you could not survive being seen as impure, corrupted, cursed by the gods. That followed you forever. The families also suffered. When a woman was condemned for sacrilege, her entire family could be punished. Not legally in most cases, but socially. Her father might lose political appointments. Her brothers might be denied military promotions. Her husband, if she was married, might be forced to divorce her. The family name was tainted. This created intense pressure on women to conform. Because it wasn't just your own life at stake. It was everyone connected to you. One mistake, one accusation, and you could destroy your entire family's future. Why this system worked? This variety of punishments, exile, shaming, confiscation, imprisonment, execution, was deliberate. It meant that no woman, regardless of class or status, was safe. Rich women feared losing their wealth. Poor women feared exile. Noble women feared public shaming. Priestesses feared execution. Everyone had something to lose. And that fear maintained control. Because when everyone is afraid, no one rebels. Religion was power. We need to be very clear about something. In ancient Rome, religion and politics were not separate. They were the same thing. Priests were politicians. Politicians were priests. The same men who made laws also interpreted omens. The same men who commanded armies also performed sacrifices. And the same men who accused women of sacrilege stood to gain politically from those accusations. The Pontifex Maximus. The chief priest of Rome was called the Pontifex Maximus. This was not just a religious title. It was a political office. And it was held by some of the most powerful men in Roman history. Julius Caesar was Pontifex Maximus. Augustus was Pontifex Maximus. Eventually, Roman emperors automatically held the title. The Pontifex Maximus controlled religious law, the calendar, which determined when religious festivals occurred, the Vestal Virgins' sacred rituals interpretation of omens. This gave him enormous power. If he wanted to accuse someone of sacrilege, he could. If he wanted to protect someone, he could do that too. And no one could overrule him, because he spoke for the gods. Accusations as political weapons. Throughout Roman history, accusations of sacrilege were used to destroy political enemies. Here's how it worked. You have a rival. Someone competing for the same office. Someone whose family threatens your family. You can't just assassinate them, that's too obvious. But you can whisper that their wife has been seen at suspicious religious gatherings, that their daughter has been careless with temple rites, that their mother has been consulting foreign priests. Once the rumor starts, it spreads. And if the political moment is right, if Rome is suffering from plague, famine, or military defeat, that rumor can become an accusation. And an accusation can become a trial. And a trial can end with exile, confiscation, execution. Your rival is destroyed. Not by you, by the gods. Or so everyone believes. The destruction of families. Some of Rome's most prominent families were brought down through accusations of sacrilege. When a man was declared a traitor, his property was confiscated and his name was erased from public records. But often, that wasn't enough. To truly destroy a family, you had to go after the women. Accuse his wife of impiety. Accuse his daughters of participating in forbidden rites. Once they were condemned, the family's reputation was annihilated. No one would marry into that family. No one would do business with them. No one would vote for them. They were socially dead. The case of Pomponia Graecina. In 57 AD, a noblewoman named Pomponia Graecina was accused of practicing a foreign superstition. She was the wife of a Roman general. Wealthy. Influential. The accusation was vague, but it was serious enough to bring her to trial. She was judged by her husband. According to ancient custom, a man could judge his own wife in certain cases. He acquitted her, but the accusation stuck. For the rest of her life, she was viewed with suspicion. Some historians believe she was an early Christian. Others think she was simply politically inconvenient. Either way, the accusation was enough to damage her. The Senate's role. The Roman Senate officially had no direct power over religious matters. That was the domain of the priests. But in practice, the Senate and the priesthood were deeply intertwined. Senators were also priests. Priests were also senators. So when the Senate wanted to suppress a religion, like the Bacchanalia, they used religious law to do it. They framed it as a spiritual threat, a danger to the Pax Deorum. And once it was framed that way, anyone who resisted could be accused of impiety. It was a perfect system of control. Moral panic and scapegoating. During times of crisis, Rome experienced what we would today call moral panics. Something goes wrong, plague, famine, military defeat, and people demand an explanation. The authorities need to provide one. Quickly. And the easiest explanation is, someone has angered the gods. So they look for someone to blame. Someone already marginal. Someone already distrusted. Foreign women. Priestesses of foreign gods. Women who don't conform to Roman ideals of modesty and obedience. These women become scapegoats. Not because they actually did anything wrong, but because blaming them is easier than blaming the generals who lost the war. Easier than blaming the senators who mismanaged the treasury. Easier than admitting that sometimes bad things just happen. The power of fear. The political brilliance of religious accusation is that it operates through fear. You don't have to arrest everyone. You don't have to execute dozens of people. You just have to make an example of one woman, one high-profile case, one dramatic punishment, and everyone else falls in line, because they've seen what happens when you step out of line. When you're too visible, too independent, too associated with the wrong people. They've seen the trial, the condemnation, the destruction, and they think, I will not be next. So they conform. They stay quiet. They obey. And the system continues. Exceptions and protections. It's important to note that not every accusation led to conviction. Women with powerful families could sometimes escape. If your father was a consul, your brother a general, your husband a senator, you had protection. Those men could intervene, call in favors, bribe officials, threaten retaliation, and often that worked. The charges would be quietly dropped, or delayed until the crisis passed. But that protection only existed for the elite. For everyone else, for the majority of women in Rome, there was no safety net. You were at the mercy of the priests, the politicians, and the mob. The long-term impact. This system of religious accusation shaped Roman society for centuries. It reinforced gender hierarchies. It maintained political control. It justified imperial expansion. And it taught Romans that some people's lives were expendable, that when the gods demanded sacrifice, you gave it to them, even if the gods were just men in robes interpreting bird flight. The constant surveillance. For women in ancient Rome, especially those connected to religious institutions or prominent families, life was lived under constant surveillance. Not in the way we think of surveillance today. There were no cameras, no recording devices, but there were eyes. Neighbors watching, slaves reporting, rival families gathering information. Everyone was a potential witness. And in a society where religious accusations could be based on rumor, perception, and interpreted omens, that surveillance was terrifying. One mistake. It took very little to trigger an accusation. Speaking too freely, being seen with the wrong person, missing a ritual detail. For a Vestal Virgin, even a moment of carelessness could be catastrophic. If the sacred flame went out while you were on duty, even if it was an accident, even if it was due to wind or rain, you could be blamed. Because in Rome's logic, if you were truly pure, the gods would have protected the flame. If it went out, that meant something was wrong with you spiritually. The whispers. Accusations often started as whispers. Someone saw you. Someone heard something. Someone interpreted your behavior as suspicious. And once the whispers started, they spread. The forum was the center of gossip in Rome. People gathered there daily to talk, trade, argue. And one of their favorite topics was scandal. A noblewoman seen leaving a temple at an unusual hour. A priestess who seemed distracted during a ceremony. A widow who didn't mourn with sufficient drama. These were the kinds of details that could snowball into accusations. You couldn't defend yourself. Here's one of the cruelest aspects. You often didn't know you were being accused until it was too late. There was no formal notification. No legal process requiring someone to inform you. You might just wake up one day to find priests at your door. Or soldiers. By the time you realized what was happening, your reputation was already damaged. Because the accusation itself was evidence. If someone important enough believed you were guilty, many others would assume there must be truth to it. The isolation. Once accused, you were often isolated. Friends stopped visiting. Family members distanced themselves. Not because they believed you were guilty, but because being associated with someone accused of sacrilege was dangerous. It could bring divine displeasure onto them as well. So people protected themselves by abandoning you. And you faced the trial, and whatever came after, alone. The religious anxiety. Roman religion was not comforting. It was transactional, contractual, anxiety-inducing. The gods were not loving. They were powerful and easily offended. And they communicated through signs that had to be interpreted by priests. So you never knew for certain if you were in good standing with the gods. You could perform every ritual perfectly. Live a blameless life. Obey every rule. And then a plague would strike. Or a crop would fail. Or an enemy would win a battle. And suddenly, people were looking for someone to blame. And if the omens pointed to you, or if someone with power decided they pointed to you, there was nothing you could do. The particular fear of Vestals. The Vestal Virgins lived with a specific kind of fear. They were honored, respected, given privileges no other women in Rome enjoyed. They could own property, testify in court, walk the streets without male guardianship. But all of that came with the knowledge that one accusation could end in live burial. Every relationship had to be carefully managed, every conversation monitored, every gesture controlled, because even the appearance of impropriety could be enough. The fear was generational. This fear was passed down from mother to daughter. Girls grew up watching how their mothers navigated religious life, how they performed rituals, how they spoke about the gods, how they avoided situations that could be misinterpreted. And they learned, be careful, be obedient, be invisible when necessary, because visibility could be dangerous. The psychological toll. Living under this kind of constant fear takes a psychological toll. It creates hypervigilance, anxiety, a sense that you're never truly safe. You start censoring yourself, changing your behavior, avoiding people and situations that might be risky. You stop trusting others because anyone could become a witness against you. And you internalize the idea that you are always one mistake away from destruction. This is not just fear. This is a form of social control so effective that people police themselves. They don't need soldiers on every corner. They don't need laws covering every situation. They just need everyone to be afraid enough to conform. The fear served a purpose. Rome's religious system was designed to create this fear. Not accidentally, deliberately, because fear is an incredibly effective tool of governance. When people are afraid, they're obedient. They don't question authority. They don't rebel. They don't demand change. They just try to survive. And a population trying to survive is a population that's easy to control. The core belief. To understand why Rome treated accusations of sacrilege so severely, you have to understand Rome's core belief about religion. If rituals failed, the gods would abandon them. If the gods abandoned them, the empire would fall. This was not metaphor, not philosophy. To Romans, this was literal truth. The empire existed because the gods allowed it. Rome's military victories weren't just the result of superior tactics. They were proof of divine favor. Rome's wealth wasn't just from conquest and trade. It was a blessing from the gods. And if that divine favor was withdrawn, if the Pax Deorum was broken, everything would collapse. The ritual had to be perfect. Roman religion was obsessed with precision. Every ritual had to be performed exactly correctly. The right words, the right gestures, the right timing. If a priest mispronounced a single word during a ceremony, the entire ritual was invalid and had to be started over. We have records of rituals being repeated dozens of times because of minor errors. This wasn't bureaucracy. It was theology. Romans believed that ritual was a form of contract law. You performed the ritual correctly, and the gods were obligated to respond. But if the ritual was flawed, the contract was void. Worse, it might anger the gods. When things went wrong. So when disaster struck, plague, famine, military defeat, Rome's first response was to check the rituals. Had something been done wrong? Had someone been impure? Had a sacred vow been broken? If they could identify the flaw, they could fix it. Perform the ritual again. Remove the impure person. Restore divine favor. This is why accusations of sacrilege spiked during times of crisis. Rome needed an explanation. And more importantly, Rome needed a solution. Identifying and punishing the guilty person was that solution. It allowed Rome to say, "We have corrected the error. The gods will forgive us now." Punishment as restoration. From Rome's perspective, punishing a woman for sacrilege was not cruelty. It was restoration. You weren't destroying a person. You were removing a source of pollution. You were cleansing the community, re-establishing the proper relationship with the divine. The woman's suffering was unfortunate, but it was necessary, because her continued existence, if she truly was impure, threatened everyone. This is how you rationalize cruelty. You frame it as necessary, as protective. You're not the villain. You're the defender of civilization, the collective over the individual. Roman society was not individualistic. The collective, the family, the city, the empire, was more important than any single person. So when a woman was accused of sacrilege, the question was never, "Is this fair to her?" The question was, "What does the community need?" And if the community needed a scapegoat to restore divine favor, then that's what she became. Her individual innocence or guilt was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the ritual of punishment, the public demonstration that Rome took divine law seriously. Gendered punishment. We talked earlier about how women were punished differently than men. This wasn't random. It reflected Rome's beliefs about gender and spiritual power. Women were seen as particularly vulnerable to spiritual corruption. They were closer to the natural world, through childbirth, menstruation, domestic rituals. And that closeness made them powerful but also dangerous. If a woman became impure, her pollution was seen as especially contagious. So the punishment had to be especially severe, not as revenge, but as containment. You had to remove her completely, erase her, make sure her corruption didn't spread. The warning to others. Every punishment served a secondary purpose, deterrence. When a Vestal was buried alive, when a priestess was exiled, when a noblewoman was publicly shamed, every other woman in Rome saw it and learned. This is what happens when you step out of line. This is what happens when you're accused. This is what happens when the gods are displeased. The punishment of one woman kept thousands of others obedient. The illusion of control. There's something deeply human about Rome's response to crisis. When bad things happen, especially random, uncontrollable things like plague or famine, people need to feel like they can do something. They need to feel like they have control. Identifying and punishing a scapegoat provides that illusion. You can't control whether crops fail, but you can control whether you punish the person responsible for angering the gods. It doesn't actually solve the problem, but it feels like action. And feeling like you're doing something is often more important than actually solving anything. The economic angle. There was also an economic component. Religious trials often resulted in confiscation of property. That property went to the state, or to the officials managing the case. So there was a financial incentive to accuse wealthy women of sacrilege. You could eliminate a political rival, reinforce religious authority, and enrich yourself all at once. This wasn't always the primary motivation, but it was often a factor. The system reinforced itself. The genius, if you can call it that, of Rome's system was that it reinforced itself. Every punishment proved that sacrilege was a real threat. Every accusation proved that the priests were necessary to protect Rome. Every conviction proved that the system worked. And so the system continued. For centuries. Because once you've built a structure where religion justifies power, and power justifies violence, and violence justifies itself as divine necessity, it's very hard to dismantle. You'd have to question the gods themselves. And in Rome, that was the one thing you could never do. Looking back, today we look at these rituals and see cruelty, or fear, or politics disguised as religion. We see women being sacrificed, not to appease the gods, but to maintain a system of power. But in ancient Rome, this was protection. Or at least, that's what they believed. When faith controls power. The most disturbing lesson from Rome is not that religion was cruel. It's that religion was used to make cruelty seem necessary. When you can frame violence as divine will, you can justify almost anything. Exile becomes righteousness. Execution becomes duty. Burial alive becomes an act of spiritual hygiene. And the people doing it, the priests, the magistrates, the crowd, they're not villains in their own story. They're heroes, protectors, guardians of civilization. Accusation as a weapon. Rome taught us something important about how power operates. Accusation is a weapon. And when that accusation is religious, when it's framed as a matter of divine law rather than human judgment, it becomes almost impossible to defend against. Because you're not just fighting people. You're fighting the will of the gods. And how do you prove the gods aren't angry with you? You can't. You can only suffer. And hope that your suffering satisfies whoever is watching. The gods were always watching. In Rome, the gods were always watching. That's what people believed. And that belief gave enormous power to the people who claimed to speak for those gods. The priests, the augurs, the Pontifex Maximus. They could interpret omens, declare someone guilty, order punishment, and no one could question them, because questioning them meant questioning the gods. The archive remains. These stories survived because the Romans wrote them down, not as crimes, not as injustices, but as history, as examples, as proof of Rome's devotion to the gods. The execution of Vestals was recorded in official chronicles. The suppression of the Bacchanalia was documented by senators. The trials, the accusations, the punishments, all of it was preserved, not to shame Rome, but to celebrate its righteousness. And now, centuries later, we read those same records and see something else. We see a system of control masquerading as faith. Why we study this? We don't study Rome to judge them from our moral high ground. We study them to recognize the patterns, to understand how societies use religion to justify violence, how they weaponize faith to maintain power, how they train people to accept cruelty as necessity. Because those patterns didn't die with Rome. They've appeared again and again throughout history. In witch trials, in inquisitions, in theocratic regimes. Whenever religion and power merge, this is the risk. The question for today, the question this history asks us is simple. What are we willing to accept in the name of faith? What violence are we willing to justify as divine will? Who are we willing to sacrifice to maintain order? Rome had its answers. And for 1,000 years, those answers built an empire. But they also buried women alive. The final truth. In ancient Rome, breaking a sacred law was not just a crime. It was an offense against the gods themselves. And when the accused was a woman, the punishment became something more than justice. It became ritual. It became spectacle. And sometimes, it became silence. The silence of a woman sealed in the earth. The silence of a crowd walking away. The silence of history, which recorded the punishment but rarely the innocence. This was forbidden archives, where we open the chapters history tried to bury. This story was not hidden. It was preserved, but it was never meant to be questioned. Until now.